Well, yesterday I left off talking about basically being faithful, being committed, sticking with what God has put in front of you. And believe it or not, when we talk about fighting the good fight of faith, which was Paul's encouragement to Timothy, we underestimate how important it is to first and foremost do what he says again in verse 19, where he says, holding on to faith. The holding on is the critical part of it all. I remember years ago, a pastor got really discouraged and decided not to show up to lead a Bible study one night, began to make excuses for why he wasn't going to be there because he was discouraged. And I remember my pastor saying to me simply, he said, well, I guess the devil won that battle. And I say that because I can't tell you how many times that I haven't felt physically or emotionally like I wanted to go and teach a Bible study or minister to people. And I can't even tell you how many times that in the process of preparing to go and minister, that you go through all sorts of different painful and hurtful things. There have been so many times in my life that I've wanted to pull a Richard Nixon, where you remember when he resigned, he said, you won't have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore. And, this kind of self-pity that takes hold of you because people don't like you. It's kind of like the joke I heard years ago about the guy who was saying to his mom, I don't want to go to church. I don't like those people. They don't like me. I just don't want to go there anymore. And his mother said to him, well, you don't have a choice. You're the pastor. And when I heard that joke, I thought to myself, yeah, I've been there. I've been in that place where you're going through all sorts of difficult things. And you just feel like saying, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm just tired of it. As a former pastor, retired pastor of mine told me recently, I was asking him what happened, and he just said, I got tired of the politics. Well, politics may not be what we like to refer to it, and we often say politics shouldn't be in the church, but politics is nothing else but the interaction of people. And basically, politics means that we react in a way in which we enact with each other so that we can react to things in a positive way. And oftentimes, coming to those conclusions, coming to that point of agreement can be a very difficult process, a hard process. And most of us would just simply like to take our marbles and go home. I don't want to put up with this anymore. I'm moving on. And I admit that as a pastor, there's been so many times where I've wanted to do that. Now, am I saying it's never appropriate for somebody to leave a church and find another one? I couldn't say that at all, because I think sometimes people need to move on for their own spiritual growth. And I think there are times where God says it's time for you to leave. That was true for me one time where I was involved with a ministry and they decided that they were going to go in a direction that I knew I wasn't supposed to go in. And I felt God very clearly telling me that the appropriate thing for me to do was just simply move on. And that's how I ended up at Calvary in Costa Mesa. But it wasn't like I was bitter or angry at those people. I just knew that it wasn't God's will for me to stay there, that God had called me to something different. And over the years, I've had many, many people in our congregation who have come to me and said, I just feel like God is leading me someplace else. So much so that I've often believed that part of our ministry is to equip people to go and serve in other churches and other places. I've had pastors thank me for people who moved from our congregation to theirs. They said, because these people, they know the word, they know how to serve, and they tithe. And so he says, they're the biggest blessing I've had in years. And so I count that as part of the fruit and part of the effectiveness and part of the joy. But saying that at the same time, it's not leaving before you're supposed to leave, and certainly not leaving in the way that you're not supposed to leave. And I think it's very clear that when God is calling us on to something different, He makes it so very, very clear that we know in the depth of our heart that we're doing the right thing. And we're not reacting to other people, we're obeying God. And that's really a critical point, because you may find yourself at loggerheads over the direction a church is going or the way that the church leadership is behaving. And I'm not saying that sometimes they don't become immoral or unhealthy and become unbiblical. But the reality is, it's got to be that God's telling you it's time to move on, not you just getting fed up and marching out. There's such a huge difference between the two, because if you get fed up and you leave that way, you're going to become an angry, resentful person. And everybody you talk to, you're going to want to share what you didn't like about them. I mean, over the years, I've had so many people come up to me and say, "Oh, Pastor, I love this church. It's the greatest church in the world." And then the next thing out of their mouth is, "Unlike the church I was just at, you can't believe," and they start tracking and dogging on that church and the pastor. Well, it may all be true. But the whole point is, it makes me wonder, how long will it be before they're starting to say that about me? Because as Bobby Knight said, the famed basketball coach, he said, "I never take transfer students on my team because I find that they're unhappy people looking for a new place to be unhappy." Again, to be clear, I'm not saying that you should never move on, that you never need to find a new place to grow in, but make sure that you're being moved from one place where you've grown to your limitations. You may be in a pot that doesn't allow you to grow anymore, and that's when you need to be transplanted. But make sure that it's the gardener who's transplanting you and not you just ripping yourself up by the roots and sticking yourself into new ground. You will regret that. I can only tell you, you will regret that. One pastor, an elderly mentor of mine, told me many years ago, he said, "The biggest mistake I ever made was leaving a pastorate to take a more influential and larger pastorate." He was a Brit, and he had made that decision. Well, a church in London had offered him a position, and it was a bigger, more prestigious church, and he says, "I took it." And he said, "It was the biggest mistake I ever made because I had to start all over again." And that's why he said, "You guys at Calvary, you guys got it right. You stay in one church for the rest of your life." And I remember hearing that and thinking to myself, wow, I'm glad I'm getting this counsel before I have to face the trial. But that's the whole point, is that it's so important that part of fighting the good fight of faith is not giving up. In fact, when Paul wrote to the letter to the Ephesians in the 2nd chapter, he's talking about the spiritual warfare, and 3 times in a row he says, "Stand. Having done everything you can do, stand. And having stood therefore, stand." You might want to look that up yourself. But this thing he reiterates in verses 10, 11, and 12 of Ephesians chapter 6 about the idea of just holding your ground. And it's interesting that Paul says that in the context of the Roman military equipment, which he was describing, putting on the full armor of God, because part of standing, holding the ground, was the key to Roman victory. They had special hobnailed sandals, or boots they call them, and they used to lock those into the ground, and they put their shields up, and they would absorb the attacks of the enemy. And usually after the 3rd time an enemy had come slamming up against their shields, that they begin to fall back. And that's when they begin to move forward and take ground. But the first step and the first thing legions had to be taught was a discipline of holding the ground that they already had. So when you look at where you're going to church, where the places where you've been given to serve within that church, realize that that's ground, holy ground, that God has given to you. And you need to be faithful to hold that until such a time as God says, now you can begin to move forward and take new ground. But it's a terrible thing when you flee the field and you leave the ground to the enemy, and then you've lost something irreplaceable. So it's really important, I think, as Paul says, that we need to hold on to the faith, not to make shipwreck. We'll talk about that later, about when he talks about Hymenaeus and Alexander, who had made shipwreck of their faith. And we'll talk a little bit about what that probably meant. But it's so important for us to realize that we're called to hold on to the faith that has been given to us and to hold on to the ground. That means we hold on to our commitment to Christ. We hold on to our commitment to His Word. We hold on to His commitment to His church universal, but also maybe holding on to that fellowship of believers that God has called us to be a part of. And I've always felt like basically the day that we're supposed to make that change, God will make it so clear that nobody will have to wonder. It'll be clear that this is what God has done, and we're simply being obedient to His will. Boy, I hope that makes sense. I mean, kind of a sermon I preached at you, but I hope it connects with you. We'll pick this up tomorrow. Blessings.